Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ryan the Ride Mechanic channel. On today's video, is that my hair? Jeez. Boy, that looks like absolute crap. Today's video is going to be adjusting my hair. Holy crap, that looks bad.
Now get ready. Here we go.
Alright, this is your first time here. Make sure you like and subscribe. Do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out. I do appreciate it. Alright, today's video, sorry for the interrupted intro, is going to be, so a long time ago I did a video about basically the off-season, the rehab, how that works, how it starts, refurbishment of rides, what we do when the park is closed, that sort of stuff. And I went back and watched that video recently and I was like, hey, you know what? The video is absolute crap. Like, man, that was bad. Now, I remember when I started making YouTube videos, they said, the first bunch of videos you make, you are not going to like those videos. And they were right. Like, man, those are some bad videos. But live and learn, right? We can't get to where we are if we don't go through the learning steps first. What I wanted to talk about is number one question I get from all sorts of people, all walks of life when it's talking about amusement parks. And I work maintenance, and the first question that they always ask is, what do you do when the park closes? Like for the off season, what do you do when that park closes?
Sorry, folks, park's closed. The moose out front should have told you.
So we're going to talk about two types of parks, really. The first type of park is going to be a year-round park. So there's not too much involved with those. Because they don't have much of a downtime. They don't have much of an off season. Some parks, when they're open year round, they're open 365 days. I'm not really talking about those. I'm talking about ones that go into like a weekend only operation thing, and they just close for a handful of weekends here and there for the major holidays and stuff. The other type of park is what I would call a more traditional park, where it closes down for a bunch of months at the end of the year. Typically, parks a lot of times will do like it used to be like November through April downtime. That's like when I started working at my park. That's what we had, was when our fright season was over, it started our refurbishment, and that went all the way through about the middle of April when the park opened back up. Then the park started going more towards year-round operation, and I had to come up with a schedule to adjust for that. I'll talk about that as well. So I guess let's start with the traditional park, like where I was. So the park would close down at the end of October, very beginning of November, and be closed all the way through till April. And people say, man, you got all that time off, like 5 months, 5.5 months off. What do you do during that time? Do you get laid off? Do you have work to do? Is there other work happening in the park? And the answer is yes, we have tons of work to do in the park. So what happens with those type of parks is typically towards the end of the season, they start I have a video on this one as well. They start deferring maintenance, and they're like, our rehab, we always called it rehab. You could call it refurbishment, whatever you want to, rebuilding. Our rehab was coming up, so we would start pushing stuff off. Oh, we lost a seat on that ride. And we'd start, we'll just we'll just push it off. And it's like our rehab starts in 2 weeks. So a lot of times they just didn't fix it, and we started pushing that stuff off towards the end of the season. But that was to save time in other places. We had bigger fish to fry, so it was kind of some of that little stuff started falling by the wayside. So when it came time to, all right, November came around, park is closed, what do we do? Well, for those type of parks, typically it's all the major roller coasters go into refurbishment. And it's like, okay, so each one gets, first thing you do to them is you take them off the track. You send them around, you get them to wherever they need to be. Lots of roller coasters have certain places and only one place where a train can actually be taken off of the track or taken off of a work bay, depending on where it might be. There are plenty of trains where the work bay, a nice, covered work bay or a garage almost, can be torn apart right there in the work bay. And it doesn't really need to come out and go anywhere. But a lot of these parks that are down for 3, 4, 5 months out of the year are typically down that way because the park is in winter time. It's in heavy snow, things like that. The weather is really bad, so you don't want those workers outside. A lot of those parks have already done things like their work bays for rides are covered, they're heated, and that's more of a creature comfort for the people working on them, but that also pays off during this time of year when it's freezing cold outside, snowing and everything else. It's like, okay, yeah, for those things, it's like you can actually work in the work bay and do that stuff. And you could tear the trains apart, you could put them through NDT, all that stuff necessary. So the first step is to take all the trains off the track. And you can approach this more, step driven 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and say, well, we can take off this coach or this train and refurbish it and put it back on the track and then take off the next train. And you could focus your manpower and effort on one particular thing to get it done as fast as possible. That's a good theory. The only problem is a lot of times by the time you get to that second train is that now it's deeper into the winter time. There's more cold, it's colder, there's more ice out on things, the conditions are more dangerous to move these things around in, so you just don't want your workers outside in that environment doing that unless they absolutely have to. The other thing is it becomes a timing domino effect. So you always plan to follow the schedule as is. No, just like we're going to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And you're going to go through and do all those things. But the major problem with that is that if project number 1 falls behind by a week, it's like, okay, it's a week. We can catch that up. Project number 2 might fall behind a little bit, maybe just by a week. But that's cascading off of project number 1, remember. So now you have project number 2 is 2 weeks behind. And then number 3 might be off by 1 week, but now it's 3 weeks behind. And so on and so forth. So by the end, you might not have a ride open when the park opens because your other stuff just fell behind. When you do the mass takeoff and you take all the rides off at the same time, you can make up that time because when Project A starts falling behind, you just shift your manpower a little bit and you work on Projects B and C and those other ones, and you get them actually running ahead of schedule. That way you can make up the time when that first one starts to come back. So it's like, okay, so the first thing you do is pull all the trains off the track, get them back to the shop in a safe place wherever they work. We didn't have a huge shop where we were. It can only hold about 2, 3 trains. Maybe if the third train was small, it can only hold about 3 in there at one time. Now, we did have a very small shop. There's no beating around the bush about it. I've been to other parks and seen their maintenance bays, and they have some huge shops to work in. Not to mention huge places at the ride. So some places, if the train didn't have to leave the ride, if it could stay close by, it would do that. Other times, you would improvise and do things. We had one area of the park where during our fright time of year, we took the bumper cars off and we housed that building in, and we put up walls around it because it turned into a haunted house. We put a floor down and the bumper cars became a haunted house. Really cool, right? Well, after the fright time was over, show productions would come in and they would take out all the fright stuff out of there, and we'd tell them, hey, leave the walls up and the floor in. We, as in the maintenance department, because those 2 different departments, show productions and maintenance, we as in maintenance will take the floor out and we'll take the walls down and we'll get it all back and squared away at the end of the season. They would go, okay. So then we would go across the way down there and we would grab our little kids train off of it was just a little Zamperla family coaster. We would take that train off of there, which all you needed was a forklift for that. We'd take that train off of there, and then we go over and we put it in the haunted house, essentially. And we just set it there, and then those guys could go down there, and they have a nice big open space to work on attractions and things like that down there. And we had like another maintenance staging area. It happens all the time. People can use big indoor eating areas and stuff like that as long as you don't mess up the floor. The park's typically open for maintenance doing whatever they want to because they don't really care until you mess something up. The first time you make a divot out of that nice polished floor and you have to fix it, and that comes out of the maintenance budget to fix the thing, it's not good. And it's like, okay, well, you guys can't work in there anymore if that's the way it's going to be. But temporary haunted houses make a great place during the off season to refurbish things. It does work out pretty well. So, how does train refurbishment go? I'll give you the big bullet points. It's pretty much the same for everywhere. It doesn't matter the schedule. First thing you do, take them off the track. Check. We got that. Take it back to the shop. Tear it down. Pull everything apart. Get all the parts and pieces apart from each other into big components. Okay, we got all that. What do you do next? And next is weeks of people washing things. All the parts, the pins that came out that are all greasy, they're covered in hair, grease, and everything else. Those have to be clean. They've got to be nice and clean before they could be sent out for NDT. That's non-destructive testing. So we take all the thing apart, we clean everything up really nice, and then all the pins go out in a huge crate. We take all the pins to a ride and we put them in a big crate and we send them out for NDT. Some parks have companies that come in and do the NDT on the spot. That way that stuff doesn't leave. That's the preferred method to do it because the less time you have parts leaving your place and coming back, the less likely they are to get lost, to get damaged, all sorts of other things. You drop one of those pins, it could fail NDT, and then that's really bad news depending on what type of pin it is. You might not have another one in stock, and it might be a really long lead time item where even the manufacturer doesn't have something in stock. So you have to be really careful with stuff when you take it apart and put it back together. That's the pins. So out of there you have wheel carrier pins, pivots, where the upstop and guide wheels go in. Those have pins in them that they pivot on. Those pins have to come out for NDT. The wheels, everything that has a wheel on it has a pin that goes through it. Those pins come out for NDT. The wheel carrier swings on a pivot. That pivot pin has to come out for NDT. Older B&Ms have a big Roth bearing on top. For the floorless models, they've got a big Roth bearing. That bearing has to get NDT'd. For inverts and stuff like that, they have a giant pin that sits through the top of the thing. Instead of a Roth bearing, it's got smaller bearings in it. Those don't require so much NDT as they just require replacing during the off season, so that's not a really big deal. But that big pin that goes through the whole assembly, Intamin would call those a king bolt that sits in there. It looks like a big T that sits inside the thing. Those pins have to go out for NDT. You're talking hitch forks, 2-axis blocks, couplings, cardan blocks, anything in the restraint assembly. Some rides are really easy. They just got a couple little paws and a ratchet shaft down the center like the old Arrow/Vekoma rides. And then some of them, like B&Ms, they have all sorts of little teeth and cams and stuff like that that all have to get individually taken apart, cleaned really well, and then NDT'd. Now, lots of emphasis on cleaning here. Why cleaning? I mean, it makes sense to a lot of people. Yeah, you want to clean the parts but to what? To what? Why do you want to clean the parts? So the first thing is you want to inspect the parts to see if they're okay. Because if I pay a mechanic to sit there and they take that part and they go, oh yeah, look at this. I'm going to take this part and I'm going to clean it and I'm washing it. And then as I'm washing it really good on the inside, I go, oh, hey, look at that. Hey, boss, half this wheel is missing. And I go, hey, look at that. I did not have to pay an NDT company to fail this part. I looked at it on my own and said, yeah, we probably shouldn't. We should throw this one away. Yeah, throw that one away. Now that's a slippery slope because sometimes things don't require full NDT. For instance, we'll use the wheel as an example. On the Vekoma rides, I have a lot of experience with those. They used cast aluminum wheels. I really don't know why I was going to go into explaining that when I just walked across my office and just grabbed the wheel. Duh. I forget about that sometimes. All right, so here's a wheel off of a Vekoma ride, right? This is a 6-inch. This is a, it's not 6 inches. What is this? No, I guess it is 6 inches. Anyways, this would be a guide or an upstop wheel for an SLC or a boomerang. There's actually only 4 millimeters difference outside diameter for the two. doesn't really matter. But we have to send these out and get these tested. And for each one, for a guide wheel, we had to send 6 guide wheels. For an upstop wheel, we had to send 6 guide wheels to be done. Now, for this particular one, the reason why I have this one is because when we washed it, I don't know if you can see that right there. When we washed it, we were able to see that there is a crack right there in this ribbing. Now, this is the area when these things are NDT. There's not much to NDT on a wheel, but these old cast aluminum hubs were prone to cracking in this exact area right here. So they said in these little supports right here, check for cracking inside there. Now, you can look at that one of 2 ways. You could say, well, this one's cracked, so grab a different one, and those are the 6 that goes out. Or this is a proactive measure for me. So when they said, hey, boss, this one is cracked, I'm like, you're right, that one's cracked. We have to send 6 of these out. And that's when I would say, nope, send them all out, every single one. Because the 6 is assuming everything is okay. Because how many guide wheels and upstop wheels are you using? Well, it depends on what, like these guys here, they were using the same size for everything. So there was basically 6 per coach. 6 per coach. And the SLC we had was 10 coaches long plus the tail. So we used 66 of these wheels on the train. Now, if I sampled 6 of these wheels and one had a crack, that's not really good. That's like, okay, you could have a larger percentage of wheels cracked out there. So the NDT had stipulations that said, well, if you find a crack on a sampled batch, means you didn't send a whole batch, you didn't send everything, you just sent a sample. If you find a crack on a sampled batch, you need to send everything out there. So this is the catalyst to say, okay, we found a crack on one, send them all out. And then all those wheels would have to go out for NDT testing and get checked just like they do every year. In fact, wheels oftentimes for the company we were using, they kind of had like a greenish tinge to them a little bit. And that greenish tinge was actually the stuff that they used to check the aluminum, because you can't use normal magnetic particle testing on these. You have to use dye penetrant or eddy current, depending on what the company wants to do for it. So all those pins, all those wheels, everything would get NDT'd. And the deal is that when you have something like a pin, it puts a very fine powder, the NDT powder that goes on there. Some places use a physical, it's a dry dust. Most of the time they use red, and it looks like a red dust that's all over everything. It turns the entire shop red. And sometimes they use a liquid with a black light. That's a preferred method because it's much easier. It's a little harder to do. You have to control your environment a little better, but it's much easier to actually get in there and put liquid on top of it and then use your magnetic yoke and go across 2 ways and check that part. When your pin or whatever it is still oily, it's still greasy, it will stop the magnetic particles from getting to the surface of that steel pin. Like the magnetic particles won't go where they're supposed to, they will stop essentially. So if the NDT place gets pins that still have grease on them, and we've done it before, we ship stuff off and they call me up and they say, hey, we got a crate of pins. It doesn't look like they were washed. It's like, oh, well, crap. Because I have 2 options. One is to have them send that crate of pins back to me and re-clean it, which is time depending on where they're located. It might not be the same day. It might set things back, a week. And I can pay my guys to wash those parts up again. Or I could say, we don't have the time. Your time frames don't align with our time frames. So just go ahead and clean them yourselves. Now, I am paying an NDT company, which is very expensive. I'm paying them a lot of money to sit around and wipe grease and oil off of parts that my guys should have done. Like, that's not a good cost savings. That's going to be a very expensive NDT bill when it comes back. Typically, NDT for a train is around $7,000 or $8,000 for the NDT of a train to be done. While the guys have cleaned the pins off, and they're getting that done because I'm going to have guys working on cleaning pins, on the other side of that, and not to mix words up here, but when I say guys, I'm referring to the crew. Doesn't have to be men, can be women, of course. I just refer to the crew as the guys. Just the way it is. So I will have another part of my crew over there working on the rest of the components that were taken apart. So we took all the pins and everything out of there. So what are we left with? We're left with big steel components that are welded together. For this, the majority of time, those things are called weldments. It's really weird to think about. Everything is a weldment. Everything is a weldment. The wheel carrier is a weldment. The frame, the chassis, I would call the chassis the coach. The chassis, the coach, is also a weldment. The seat upright that you're sitting on, it's a weldment. It's like the piece that the chain dog goes into and they mount up inside the coach like that. Another weldment. It's a generic term. It refers to just things being put together in some sort of an assembly. That's a weldment. So what you have to do now is you have to clean all of that stuff up and get all the grease and oil off of that again, so you can inspect it very thoroughly and look for cracks yourself to find anything. So you're not paying the NDT company to just go, this one right here, this one broken. Take that work out of there and make it a little easier on yourself for the paperwork at the end. So you take those parts and now you have to get the paint off of them. Now this is one thing it's a pain in the butt, but you have to take the paint off of the welds to inspect them. One of the biggest selling points of billet components is that there's no welds to inspect, so you don't have to take the paint off of them. Most manufacturers do stipulate that every 3 to 5 years that you have to NDT those billet components, though, because you're looking for stress fractures, even though it could just be somewhere in that metal. Don't know where, it could just be somewhere inside there. So when it comes to that, then you have to take the paint off, because there's other processes they say, well, and then probably plenty of you watching this video going, no, there's processes we could use that will go right through that paint, which was an argument I made too. Like, oh yeah, our company says they can do this stuff and it will go right through that paint. And then our state inspector was like, as long as you can guarantee me that they will find a crack underneath that paint, we can do that. But I need a guarantee that's going to happen. I went back to the NDT company. I'm like, you guys got some sort of a thing to give the state that says, yeah, we can guarantee we can do that? And no, we actually can't guarantee that will happen, because there could be something underneath the paint that we might miss. Okay, well, I guess we got to take the paint off then. So now boils down to the question, how do you want to take the paint off? Many methods to do this. Some are good, some are not so good. All of them are right, none of them are wrong. Depends on how you want to do it. So the number one method that we did, which was the preferred method, was we sent our stuff out to a shop and they sandblasted everything. They sandblasted the paint off of it. The NDT company that we hired went to that particular shop and checked that stuff at that shop. And then once they gave it a clean bill of health, that company then went ahead and cleaned it back off again, primer, prep, all that other stuff, and they put the color back on it, and then they gave it back to us. Preferred method, I definitely 100% prefer that. When we started crunching things for time later on, we couldn't do that anymore because we physically just didn't have the time to do that. So what we actually started doing was we started using needle guns or needle scalers. Now, if you've ever seen these, it looks like a long cylinder with an air hose coming out, and at the front, it looks like a bunch of, best way to describe it, they're needles, it's a needle scaler, but it looks kind of like the end of think of like a metal chopstick looking thing, like a bunch of pairs of chopsticks put together coming out of the front. And in the back, it's got an anvil that just hits those things repetitively really fast. And those needles just sit there and vibrate and buzz together. And when you put those down on top of the steel and push on it and go around, it basically starts it's micro hammering the paint off of the thing. Now, we use needle scales a lot to take the paint off of pretty much everything. It was an accepted method. It's like, yes, you can do that. Engineers cautioned us, though. They cautioned anybody that was doing that. They say, hey, they said theoretically, you could have a crack, and as you run that needle scale over it, it will push the material back together and essentially make it look like the crack isn't there. Now, never seen that happen, of course, but the engineers said theoretically, yeah, that could happen. So they warned us, like, try to use, when you're using a needle scaler, try to keep your hands light on it and move fluidly back and forth, and don't just sit there and like just hammer down on one spot, trying to prevent extra. You're basically peening the steel. You're impacting the steel like that. So engineers didn't like it so much. There was other methods. If we didn't want to send it out for sandblasting, we could do the sandblasting in-house. That raises a lot of hazmat questions, though, because now you have this paint that's coming off that you have to get rid of, and now it's mixed with sand that you have to get rid of, and everything is considered contaminated. So it's got to go through all these contamination things to leave your area. Not quite worth the hassle. There's other things. You can use walnut husks to do the like instead of sandblasting, use walnut husks, chopped up walnut husks. Does the same exact thing. You can use dry ice. Same exact thing. Lots of ways to do it. It just depends on your time and your money and all that you want to do. But so once the frames were taken down to bare steel, then we had the NDT done on the frames, and then the frames were repainted. Now, when we did them in-house, and we'd use needle scalers to take the paint off of there, well, we have to put the paint back on. A ton of parks are like, we have an entire paint department. We give them the coaches, and they take them in to their room, and they spray color on them, and they look like brand new when they come out, and it is absolutely awesome. We did not have that luxury. We really didn't. It was sad. So what we ended up having to do actually was I would have to go down to the paint store and just purchase paint. They knew me well down there because I would go buy paint all the time from them. Our paint department didn't even buy the paint. It was me. I would actually drive down to Sherman-Williams and just buy paint. In case you're wondering what type of paint goes on a roller coaster, it's an AB epoxy-based paint. So it was Sherman-Williams brand, so it was something called Sure-Krill, if I'm remembering it right. It was Sure-Krill paint. So you took this paint and then you poured it in. It had to be a certain ratio in the cup, and then you would take a hardener or an activator and pour that in as well, and you'd have to mix it together, and then it would, if you ever mixed epoxy and stuff together, it would start stinking to high heaven. You had to have the shops open and everything, and basically we would pay our mechanics to just sit there with a roller paintbrush and just roll this paint on as best they could. And I know a lot of people are like, really? No paint department? Like, what? It's like our paint department consisted of like one person who was out in the park painting handrails and buildings and insides of buildings and all sorts of other stuff. We did not have that department's resources to throw at our stuff. And there's people crying right now. And it's like, I feel your pain. Yes, I paid a lot of mechanics to sit around and paint roller coasters by hand. Absolutely mind-bending when you step back and think about all the money that takes place and all the people that have to work on things. And he's like, really? You paid mechanics to paint that by hand? What are you, crazy? It's like, yeah, crazy. So we'd paint it all back, and then the parts would come back from NDT. We would replace stuff, repair things if needed. Sometimes the welder had to make repairs on a frame, which it wasn't just, hey, weld this back together and it's all good. Repairs are very difficult. There's lots of procedures around them. So once we find a joint that has a crack in it somewhere, let's say on a frame, we have to take pictures of it. They said how many of these frames had this. It could just be a one-off location, or we said, 3 frames had it in those locations. And then we have to give that information to the manufacturer. The manufacturer takes that information and they just turn around and they just go like, they open up their files and stuff and go, oh yeah, we've had that before. We've already got a sanctioned repair procedure here. Just use this repair procedure. And it tells you exactly how to. It's typically grind out the crack, indication, because engineers don't like it when we say crack. So grind out the indication until the indication is gone. Now, how do you know when it's gone? Because you also have to have the NDT company sitting there checking the indication. And then when you grind it all out, they have to say, yes, the indication's no longer there. Sometimes they actually grind out where there's steel left in it. A lot of times you'll actually open a root up. There'll be a fissure there where there's nothing there. And it's like, okay, the crack went all the way through in that case. And then typically it's go ahead and use a specific, most of it was stick welding, typically referred to as stick. And sometimes they wanted to use TIG. Sometimes MIG was okay. It all depended on the manufacturer, the area, the process. There was so many different repairs you can do. And then once they specified a process, you had to make sure your welder was certified in that process. Because if they weren't certified for that procedure or that process to do that, then you had to have another company make that repair. Complicated things a little bit. But most of the times it was like grind it all the way out, make sure it's gone. 70-18 rod, which was very typical for shielded metal arc welding, and just fill it back up and then grind it back down. It's to the standard that they typically repair to is the D 1.1 standard. D as in dog, 1.1 standard, which requires a little bit of preheat, post-heating, grinding. You can't have an excessive cap on top. I get a little technical on that stuff, I'm sorry. Welder at heart, so I get a little deep sometimes. The repair is done after that, and of course you have NDT records stating that it failed, and then you have a repair procedure provided, and then you have NDT stating that the crack was gone, and then that it was okay afterwards. And then you typically ship that off. The manufacturer doesn't need to know that you fixed it. They just said, here's the repair process. They just assume you're going to do that and document everything on your own on your end. So then that goes back together, and then you're putting the train back together. You put the pins back in, you replace some bearings, you replace, like, this is the time all the wheel bearings were just cleaned. So this is the time to repack wheel bearings. Sometimes you get those wheel bearings and you spin them, and it's like, oh, well, this is really good for nothing. Like, well, throw that one away. Throw that one away. Doing videos now, I cringe at all the things that I've thrown away over the years. And just like, oh man. I could have had, if I had like a B&M wheel bearing, they're so nice looking. It's just a standard ball bearing. But they're just so nice looking, and there's like, oh, they're nice, but I don't want to buy one just for a video because they're like $180 a piece, and each wheel takes 2 of them. But you clean those things up, you replace what you need to. Sometimes none of them need replacing, in which case you can just save bearings that you ordered for future use, or you could say, hey, just pick 10 random ones and we're going to replace 10 random ones. You just essentially throw new ones into the train. This time is also when wheels go out for repair. Wheels are a very slippery slope with rides. you need to have wheels on the shelf to make your ride work. This wheel right here, when I send this wheel out for recoating, it goes to a shop, and it typically needs 3-ish months before it comes back. When it comes back with a sticker on it that says don't use it for another 2 months, because the urethane that's poured on here is still curing. It's not good to just run them, even though it's hard.
That's what she said.
And it's in that shape now. The urethane still can't handle the full stress that rides put on it. So even when you get the wheel back, it still needs to sit for a long time before you can actually use it. When wheels need to get retreaded or resurfaced, assuming they come back okay, sometimes, and they're NDT'd at the shop as well if you miss some out of your batch and you send them in, typically a wheel manufacturer will also NDT the aluminum part, which is called the hub. They'll NDT the hub for you. That way they know the hub is good before they go and put the urethane back on the top. But it could be 5 months turnaround for that. Now, you might not have that, in which case, if you're waiting for wheels to come back and you don't have wheels to put back on the train, your project is stuck until those wheels come back in. Then the only way around that is to, if you're in a Six Flags park, call up other Six Flags park. Call up Central Purchasing and say, hey, I need these wheels in inventory. Start taking wheels from other parks and ship them over to ours. They'll do that, no problem. I could also just call up Vekoma and say, hey, I need a bunch of these wheels. Vekoma's like, no problem. What do you want? You want cast or do you want billet? And it's like, oh, how much are the billet ones? Because billet's much nicer. I like billet wheels. They're a little bit more expensive, but a lot of times, like, they have billet ones set and ready to go. The cast ones, sometimes they have, sometimes they don't. It just depends. Most trains come off the factory floor with billet these days, I believe. The cast is kind of a thing of the past. More economical, more prone to cracking. Not great. So you put all that stuff back together, the train's sitting there ready to go. A lot of times, parks where the weather is really bad, the train just sits somewhere. You move it to a storage location, cover it, protect it from the elements, and it just sits. And it's waiting for better weather to be put back on the track. Once the train, let's say fast forward, once that train gets that good weather, it's like, okay, let's go put it on the track now. You go out there, you might need a forklift. You might need a rental crane truck that can handle a good amount of weight to lift the coach up and put it back on the track. Or you might need a full-size crane to lift an assembly up and put those trains back on the track wherever they might need to go. Again, the spot of where they come off and go on is different from everything. Sometimes you can get away with just a forklift. Sometimes you need a full-size crane to do it. So just depends on your ride and the ride's location. So it's very, very specific to each ride in particular. And then once you put it on there, you link the coaches back together because typically they're sitting there one at a time. The crew works really hard on putting everything back exactly the way it was. The train goes through a QC check once the crew is done with it. Typically the way we work, the crew was done putting the train back together, and they would call me out for a QC inspection. So I would go out there with the mechanic, and we would go out there, typically not when the rest of the crew was there. It was just typically me and the other mechanic. And I would sit there and just pick the train apart. And I would just go through and find little things wrong with it all over the place and say, fix this, fix that, fix that. You would think like, well, how often does that happen? Constantly. When you work on something constantly for like 2 months at a time, 3 months at a time, the stuff that you think would be blaringly obvious blends in. And it's just like, it's not until you get someone like me out there, not saying I'm better than everybody else, definitely not. But when you get a separate person out looking at the stuff that you just did, they see the stuff that's like, you missed this. I was looking at the back of a coach, and I looked underneath there, and I told the guy, I said, this bolt's not tight. And he is a looking mechanic, so he looks underneath there and goes, yes, it is. And I go, no, it's not. And he's like, how do you know? He's like, the torque stripe lines up. How do you know? I said, because I put my finger on the washer and the washer spins. So the bolt head's not all the way down. So he takes his tools out and starts to wrench on the bolt. He's like, well, the bolt's tight. I'm like, that means you used the wrong size bolt, and that bolt is bottomed out internally. It's like, pull it out. So he pulls the bolt all the way out, and I take out my little pocket scale and measure. I'm like, yeah, this is a 35 millimeter long bolt. That's supposed to be a 25 millimeter bolt in that location. So it bottomed out, and the washer never tightened up. So I'm like, fix that, and then go through and check all the other ones in the rest of the train just to make sure. No one's immune from this stuff. I got a train where I'm like, it was perfect. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. And my boss at the time walks out and he starts a QC at it, and he looks at it, and he doesn't even sit down because, a lot of it's looking at restraints and stuff. He doesn't even sit down. He just walks out and looks at it and goes, that hitch nut's on backwards. Call me when you're ready for QC. Oh, what a slap in the face that was. Oh my gosh. I had 2 KM nuts, which are just these big metal tapered nut looking things. On the hitches, they've got a taper facing, say, this way. Another taper that faces this way. The tapers basically go to each other like that, where they fit in next to each other. Well, on the one I did, I had put it together, and one of my tapers, just on one hitch, they were both going the same way. I didn't catch it. But it was just bad because he walked up, and the first thing he looked at was those hitch nuts, and one was on backwards. They had the right locking hardware. They were locked in and tight and everything, but it was just like the nut was on backwards. I felt bad because I had a similar one where someone did the same thing. They called me out, and I walked out there, and the first thing I walked out to, I don't know how this happened, they put a nylock on upside down. Some of the general public now is like, what? Like, a nylock on upside down is really flippin' hard to do. Now, I can't explain this. I'm not going to try to explain this, but a lot of mechanics right now are just like, how did you put a nylock on upside down? I don't know, but I went there and the nylock was upside down, and that was the first thing I saw too. When I pointed out to that guy, I'm like, well, that ain't right. You're going to have to fix that. By the way, check the train too, because whew, that's all over the place down there. Once all the QC is done and everything's good, that's when you load the train up with water dummies. Again, trains typically with all the new bushings put inside, everything is nice and tight. The bearings are nice and tight. Everything is very tight. Trains don't like tight. They like loose. They like warm and loose because they fly around the track when they're warm and loose. So when it's cold and tight, trains don't like that. So we add water dummies because we're adding as much weight as possible to the train to actually make it around that circuit the first time through. If you put it together too tight, it'll valley and it won't come back. That is no fun at all. Nobody wants to do that. We've actually purposely assembled trains loose before, like physically loose. We didn't tighten the hitch nuts down and stuff to where they were supposed to be. We left them loose just a little tiny bit so that train would break in. The lap speeds were fine, and then I went back to hitch number 9 and tightened it properly. Lap speed was fine. Okay, run it again. Tightened number 8. It's like, all right, slowed down a bit that time. But we ran it a second, third time. It's like, okay. Then I did 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 all the way back up to coach. And the train was still running consistent times. That's what you look for when you're load testing trains. You're looking for consistent times. Typically, when you start running the train, the speed is very, very low. The speed's really low. The time is really high. And then as the train runs and it breaks in, the two will start to come towards each other. The speed will start coming up, which means your lap times are coming down. And what you're looking for is those two to start to level out. And once those 2 times is leveled out and that train is running consistent lap times, lap after lap, that's when you start taking water dummies off of it. Okay, and you watch the speed, because every time you take a set of water dummies off, the train gets a little bit slower. You don't want to do shock and awe. You don't want to take all the water dummies off and send it because there's a good chance it will valley. But you're still breaking it in. So you want to do that. It's like, okay, take some off, take some off, take some off. Examples of quick load testing. I've done it to where, let's see, we loaded the train full up with water dummies. I put 20 cycles on the train full and then took another 20 cycles to unload the train. So that's about 40 cycles. And then put about another 20 or 30 cycles on that. So that's 60, maybe 70 cycles. And then that was it. I was done with that train. I'm like, good. Call it good. Now, operations still typically has a ton of cycles to put on the thing as well. Some parks are very, very meticulous about that number. Some parks are like, hey, as long as the train's all good, it's been inspected, everyone's happy with it. A lot of times insurance or state or somebody also has to inspect the train as well. So as long as they're happy with that stuff and it's running consistent, they're good with just, all right, open the thing up, we're good. Some parks are like, on top of that consistency, they're like, we need to see 500 cycles on that. That is a lot. That is an F ton worth of cycles. Like, holy crap, why would you do something like that? 100 cycles is a lot. 500 is like you're proofing something out. After you refurbish a train, you typically don't proof something out. It's like, it's a known product. You know what it is. When they made a modification to let's use the wheel carriers on the Top Thrill lawn ornament out there, they had to put like 500 cycles or something on that because it was like they were trying to proof the wheel carriers out to make sure that they weren't going to run into any more problems with those wheel carriers. But that's not the case for normal refurbishment. So that's the way it goes. You keep cycling through those rides and you have everyone working on stuff. Everyone's kind of scattered on 2, 3, 4-man crews working on these rides all throughout the park. All right, so that's traditional. Now, that was the longest part of this video because that was also the train refurbishment. That's how the refurbishment goes. So let's look at the next step up. The next step up is a park that doesn't really close. It's closed maybe during the week. So when I left the park where I was at, that's how we were. We were open every single weekend of the year. We had no more chunk of rehab, no more big refurbishment schedule. It was up to me because I was a supervisor. They said, hey, we want to go from closed for 4 months out of the year to open every single month. Can you do that? And I had to sit down and look at my schedule with everything and figure out how much time each ride took, how many people I needed to do, and the schedule and all that stuff. And I could say, yes, we can do this. In fact, not only can we do this, but I can do this with no overtime. But the park has to play nice. I can't play this game by myself. The park has to play with us. But okay, well, what do you need to do that? When I tell you that I need this ride down for this amount of time, this is the amount of time I need, and it will not be shorter. Sounds simple. It always sounds simple, but there will be fighting every step of the way, I guarantee you. Well, yeah, we can do that. Absolutely. No problem. So here's how you execute something like that. The park doesn't go down for its full refurbishment. You don't lose everything in the park. What you lose is one ride at a time, and you focus your crew on that one refurbishment at that one point in time. So what I did is I said, like our Skyrocket 2, what do you need for that ride? Start to finish, I need 9 weeks of that ride being down. Okay, that's a long time. Can you move that up any further? If we do this thing over here, I could probably get it down to 7 weeks. But we need to buy more parts because there's a good chance that might mess up. So 7 weeks at the minimum. Okay, we can do that. So we got that ready, pulled the trigger, pulled that coach off the track. Week number 3, operations is already asking me, like, when are we going to get this ride back? I told you it was going to be 7 weeks. Is there any chance we can get it next weekend? No, there's no chance we can do that next weekend. So this is the game to play, is that constant fighting. Maintenance wants more time to work on the ride. Operations wants it to be down for less time because it's hurting their overall ride package. When people come through the front gate, if they see a bunch of rides down, they don't like that, which is not the case normally. Normally, as you come in, it's like, hey, what do you have down? It's like, well, our Skyrocket's down right now. Why? For refurbishment. That makes complete sense. I know, I thought it was too. But what happens sometimes is like, okay, our Skyrocket's down, and then what happens? And then we actually just broke a gearbox on the SLC, and now the SLC's down. No, well, that sucks. Now you've got 2 roller coasters down. Actually, we lost a drive on the kids coaster, so that one's down too. I have 3 roller coasters down now. Yeah, and 3 flat rides too that aren't going to be operating right now because of one thing or the other. It's like, wow, so you have like 5 or 6 rides down at the front gate? It's like, yeah, that doesn't look good. So that's when they start asking for, what rides can we get back up and running? Like, hurry, let's put something back together. So eventually what happens is you say, here's the schedule, we have to stick to it. And then, like I started at the beginning of the video, how you say if you fall behind on Project A, Project B is also behind by the same thing. Well, that's the same exact thing that happens when you're open the whole time too, except for the difference is you don't notice it, but it takes sometimes years for it to catch up. So what happens is that, well, how do you refurbish a roller coaster that doesn't go down? Well, you refurbish like 2 trains on the track, you refurbish them one at a time. When the summer season ends, where you're open every day, that's when you take 1 train off the track. Let's say train number 1 was running, number 2 suddenly appears, and people are like, all right, there's a second train. And then the next weekend, number 2 is on the track and number 1 is sitting in transfer. It's like, still running on 1 train. And then train number 1 goes away. And then it's off for its refurbishment. And then train number 1 comes back on right before the summertime. And then summertime, you got 2 train operations during that entire time. Now the problem is that schedule, when it starts to get off, you might not notice it right off the bat. It might take a long time. It might take a couple years, but eventually you'll get into the summer season where everyone's there and it's busy and it's packed every single day, and you're running that ride with 1 train because that schedule got off. That's not a good scenario to run into at all. During that open year-round schedule, and it's the same thing at parks, whether they do it 365 days or they got the weekend to work on things, or the weekend to operate and then the week to work on things. They have to balance that schedule out. Some parks will go, so if we always need 2 trains on this ride, like it's our big premier ride, it's got to have 2 trains on it the entire time, then the option is to purchase a 3rd train. That way you're still rotating a train out, but there's always 1 in operation. Train number 1 and 2 are in operation, 3 is in rehab. 3 months later or 4 months later, trains number 2 and 3 are in operation, number 1's in rehab. 4 or 5 months later, trains number 1 and 3 are in service, 2 is in rehab. And so on and so forth. Okay, when do we do flat rides? Flat rides are actually really easy to do. They typically don't require much tear down. They require hardly any NDT. So it's something that can actually be done during the weekdays when the park is closed. You could have a couple people go out and just doing flat ride work. A lot of them are really simple. You simply just go up and you change hydraulic fluid, you change hydraulic filters, you change gear oil and things like that and service the gearboxes. There's really not much to those rides. They're typically just motors, slewing rings, gears. That's it. There's really not much to them. If there's a bigger project on that ride that needs to happen, like it uses 1 large DC motor to rotate the whole gondola, and it's like that motor needs to come off and be rebuilt, then that ride is also planned in the schedule. And they say, well, we have strong rides in that area, like everything is really strong during this time of year. So during that time of year, we might drop that ride and take it offline so we could do that repair. One of the craziest things to do when it comes along to that time, when people are like, why would you do such a thing, is to put it during a time when no one's going to notice. When is that time of year when no one would notice this flat ride being down? It's actually during the busiest time of year. The absolute busiest time of year. During the middle of summer. That's when you take the flat ride down to do something like replace the motor or do something like that. Why? Because everything else is running. Your rides package is awesome. No one's going to notice the one flat ride that's down. Most people won't care. But if you do it during that later time of year, when you already actually have those 3 roller coasters down and 2 flat rides are already down, and then you want to take the motor off the 3rd flat ride? No, people don't want to do that. They're like, take a hike. We don't want you to do that one right now. So most parks are going away from that traditional downtime schedule, and as you see, a lot of places are doing Christmas time, they're doing holidays, they're doing early openings and stuff like that. So those parks that had that dedicated off season is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Eventually, like my old park did, they'll pull the trigger and say, hey, we're going to go year round, and we'll just have to deal with a rides package that's not full because we know, maybe we can't take this ride down during that time of year. Maybe it's a ride that won't run because of the weather. It's like, no, that's too cold to run that ride. It physically won't operate in that temperature. So it's like, okay, then that would be that ride's planned downtime for that refurbishment. Flat rides are easy to schedule into stuff. So everything is just a balance. It's all about holding that schedule. And the hard one that every park seems to have trouble with, including the one where I was, it was once you start to deviate from that schedule, it requires overtime and a lot of money to pull that schedule back into line. Because if you don't want to spend the overtime and you can't get the people in to do stuff, and you can't focus on it because maybe the park wants the maintenance department doing all these other things instead of the refurbishment that they're supposed to be doing, then that schedule just starts to get deviations. It just deviates further and further and further from what it was until eventually everything is messed up. And that's what it looks like when you go into a park and during the summertime they're running one train on a lot of stuff and things are down all over the park. And it's just like, oh yeah, and people say, oh, the park's been like this for a while now. It's like that's what's happened. That schedule has gotten so deviated that nothing is aligned anymore. And it's pretty much a catastrophic failure at that point. You have to really do something drastic to get it back into line. And most of the time, it is not put the hard overtime and everything else into it to really pull the nose up on it. It's actually just to let the coin flip all the way back over and say, well, yeah, but if we just didn't open this ride for another 2 months, it would actually reset its rehab cycle, and then we would be back on time again. So then that's the park's coin toss. Do they want to let a ride like that sit down for 2 months to get back on the schedule? Or do they want to continue to push forward with it and try to get it, 8 months reversed again? Just let it flop over, go 8 months backwards. Which one you want to do? Most of the time, the park will make the wrong decision because they want the ride open. They don't want to fix the full problem. They just want their one ride back up and running again. Track and structures are a different problem. If you have gearboxes and stuff that need to be pulled and replaced, and you need downtime for one of these rides that has multiple trains on it, that's also sometimes a scheduling nightmare because it's hard to get that time allotted for it to say, all right, we're going to go put this ride through its refurbishment. And it's like, yeah, but it's got 2 trains, so we can stagger the trains. It's like, yes, but we need 3 weeks to do a project on the lift hill, let's say. Oh, really? Can't you hire somebody in from the outside and get that done quicker? And then that's to the people that fight over money. It's like, that's out of my part. That's out of my hands. If the people that have the money want to fight about that, they can fight about that. But until somebody says, yes, we're going to spend all that money to do that project quicker, it's like, it's in my court now. I have to figure out when to do it. Things like that get in the way is when you have to replace a lift chain. Like typically that's not a week job. That takes 2 to 3 weeks to replace a chain to get it back installed replacing chain liner and stuff like that and things along those lines. Water rides typically have a much larger downtime. Dedicated wintertime, people don't want to ride water rides. So it's one of those things, water rides need a lot of work. Oh my gosh, they need a lot of work. So much work. I think that's about it for this video. Considering the first time I did the video like this, it was only like 11 minutes long. I think this one's a little bit longer. We'll find out after editing. It's probably longer than 11 minutes, so I'll give you that one right now. If you want to contact me, you can always leave a comment down below, or you could email me at ryantheridemechanic@yahoo.com. Let's see. What else? Like, subscribe, do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out. I do appreciate it. All right, that's it. Stay off the air gates. Bye.